What's up, Triston Talks family? I don't know if I can see the board, but that's kind of hinting at what we're talking about today. I'm not in a regular area that I usually record. I doesn't have time to record throughout the day, so it's kind of in the evening. And after this video, I'm going right to sleep because I have a 9 a.m. in the morning. But today we're going to be talking about the philosophy of fascism and what it really talks about. We're kind of going to take the biggest, most complex ideas in history and philosophy and politics and break them down into what it actually means. So before we even start this video, we have to understand that when I talk about fascism or when I talk about this is not a political hit piece. This is not me calling names. This is not a Twitter discourse. This is a genuine, serious philosophy breakdown of one of the most consequential ideologies in human history. We're going to treat it like we're scholars that are studying this subject. But fascism is probably one of the most misused words in the English language right now, because people throw it around constantly, left, right, and center, and everybody's calling everybody a fascist. But when you use that word loosely, you strip it of its actual meaning. And when you strip it of its meaning, you lose the ability to recognize the real thing when it shows up. So we're going to talk about where fascism came from, the thinkers behind it, and how it compares to other ideologies, and why understanding it matters in the world we live in today. So where does fascism actually come from? When we think about fascism, we think about Adolf Hitler in Germany. And while Nazi Germany is absolutely part of this story, fascism as a formal ideology was originated in Italy, as we know. Or if you study history or if you study politics, you should know that. But the man behind it was Benito Mussolini. Now, Mussolini was an interesting figure. He was an interesting guy. And I don't mean that as a compliment. I mean it as a fact. Because before he became dictator of Italy, he was an intellectual. He was a journalist and a political theorist, and a man who had read Marx and Nietzsche and Sorel and Hegel. He wasn't an ignorant street brawler like they deem some fascists to be, at least not at first, of course. But he was looking at this existing political landscape and decided all of it was wrong. In 1919, Mussolini founded the Italian Combat League, and the word fascio in Italian means a bundle of sticks. And that image is actually ancient. It goes back to Rome, where a bundle of rods tied around an axe was a symbol of authority and collective strength. The idea being that one stick breaks easily, but a bundle of sticks bound together are nearly impossible to break. So that symbol became the name of fascism. The philosophy of the bound bundle, unity above all else. Now, in theory, that sounds amazing, but we're going to get into why it's not like that. By 1922, Mussolini had marched on Rome and seized power. In 1932, he co-wrote with philosopher Giovanni Gentile what became known as the doctrine of fascism. This is the closest thing that fascism has to a founding document, and it's actually worth reading, not because it's good, but because it's actually coherent. It lays out a worldview of what fascism would look like in a world. And we're going to get into 5 pillars of fascist philosophy. And so most conversations stop here because now it actually gets hard and now we actually have to think about it. But that's what I love. I love when the conversation gets hard. People treat fascism like it's just a bad vibe, or rather than an actual structured set of ideas. But it is a structured set of ideas. The scariest part is that some of these are internally logical. So I'm going to walk you through some of the core pillars, or the 5 core pillars. Pillar 1 is the state above all, and this is where totalitarianism comes into aspect. The foundational ideas of political or fascist philosophy is what Mussolini called everything within the state, nothing outside of the state, and nothing against the state. That is pretty radical if you think about it. In liberal democracy, the individual comes first. The government exists to serve the people. Rights are inherent. The state is a tool of the citizen. Fascism flips this and says that the individual has no inherent worth outside of their contribution to the collective, to the nation, or to the state. Giovanni Gentile argued that the individual is a philosophical abstraction. The only real entity is the state, and your identity, your purpose, and your meaning, all of it flows from your membership in the national community. This is why fascism is so different from other authoritarian systems. Soviet communism, for example, was also totalitarian, but it justified itself through class struggle and the economic theory. Fascism doesn't care about economics as a foundation, it cares about the nation as a spiritual and biological organism. You are a cell in a body. The body matters. The cell only matters insofar as it serves the body. Pillar 2 is ultranationalism, the nation as a mystical force. Fascism doesn't just like nationalism, it worships it. And I use the word worship deliberately because fascist nationalism has a deeply religious quality to it. The nation in a fascist thought is not just a geographic location or a legal entity. It is a living spirit, a continuous historical force that connects the dead, the living, and the unborn, that your ancestors built it and you have to maintain it, and then your children will inherit it. To betray this nation is not just treason, but it's kind of a spiritual treason, or however you say it. This is where fascism draws heavily from the philosopher Fichte, a German thinker from around the early 1800s, who argued that nations have unique spiritual characters. They call it a Volkgeist, or a national spirit, that must be preserved and expressed. The nation isn't made of laws, it's made of blood, language, culture, and shared destiny. This is also why fascism is inherently exclusive. If the nation is a spiritual organism, then not everyone can belong to it. There are always insiders and outsiders, the pure and the impure. The true members are in the infiltrators. That logic taken to its extreme is where we lead to ethnic cleansing and genocide. It's not an accident of fascism, it's a destiny built into philosophy. Pillar 3 is anti-rationalism. Here's where fascism gets philosophically wild. Most ideologies like liberalism, Marxism, conservatism appeal to reason. They say, here's the evidence, here's the logic, and here's why we're right. Forget logic. In fascism, logic is a weakness. What matters is will. What matters is action. What matters is feeling. Mussolini was heavily influenced by Friedrich Nietzsche, particularly Nietzsche's concept to the will of power. The idea that the fundamental drive of life is not all survival or happiness, but the expression of power and dominance. Now, Nietzsche himself is not a fascist and he would probably despise Mussolini, but fascists look at pieces of philosophy and weaponize them. They also draw from George Sorel, a French philosopher who argued in his book Reflections on Violence that myths, not facts, are what move mass people. You don't win a revolution with a spreadsheet, you win it with a story, a powerful, emotional, resonant myth about who we are, who your enemies are, and what our destiny is. For fascism, the myth is the nation, the story of a once great people humiliated and weakened by foreign enemies and internal traitors, now rising again under strong, decisive leadership to reclaim the glory. This sounds familiar because it should, because it's the same narrative struggle that is not unique to 1930s Europe. But the fourth pillar is the leader principle, or the Führer, or the second deuce. In fascist philosophy, democracy is a disease. Now, not an imperfect system that needs improvement, a fundamental error in how human society should be organized. Why, you ask? Because democracy assumes that ordinary people, through debate and voting, can arrive at good decisions. Fascism says that it's naive. The masses are emotional, irrational, easily manipulated, and fundamentally unqualified to govern themselves. What's needed is not a representative, but a leader. Someone who doesn't just speak for the people, but embodies the national will in their very person. The concept is called the Führer Prinzesschap or some shit like that. Germany, bro. These long ass words. But the leader principle holds that the authority flows downward from a single supreme leader whose word is law. Not because they were elected, not because they follow procedure, but because they are the nation incarnate. They claim to be the nation. To obey the leader is to obey the national spirit itself. This is why fascist regimes produce such intense personality cults. The statues, the portraits everywhere, the ritualistic chanting of the leader's name. This isn't just propaganda, this is theology. The leader is a secular God figure. The state is the church, and loyalty is worship. Pillar 5 is the glorification of violence and struggle. One of the most disturbing elements of fascist philosophy is its attitude towards violence. Most political philosophers treat violence as a last resort, something tragic, something necessary only in extreme circumstances. Fascism treats it as ennobling. Mussolini wrote that fascism believes in the sanctity of heroism, that war alone brings out all human energies to their highest tension and stamps with the seal of nobility those people who have the courage to face it. But think about that. War isn't a failure, war is a test. The ultimate proving ground of a nation's worth, a nation that avoids conflict, that chooses peace and comfort over strength and glory, that nation is decadent, and it deserves to be conquered. The philosophy draws from social Darwinism, the idea that nations like species are in constant competition, and only the strongest survive and deserve to survive. The weak has no right to exist at the expense of the strong. This is not incidental to fascism. This is structural. Violence is good in fascist thought, not just a tool but a virtue. But where does fascism exist in the political spectrum? Because, to be honest, it's complicated. Because fascism is not left-wing. It rejects Marxism, class struggle, and internationalism. Mussolini started as a socialist and then violently turned against it. He saw communism as a cancer. Internationalists, anti-nationalists focus on class rather than the nation. But fascism is also not traditionally right-wing, at least not in classical conservative sense. Traditional conservatism values institutions, tradition, stability, and gradual change. Fascism is revolutionary. It wants to burn down the existing order and replace it with something totally new. It doesn't respect old aristocracies or parliamentary systems. It worships action, youth, and power. So where is it on the spectrum? I don't know. This is why a lot of scholars debate this. Like scholars like Roger Griffin describe fascism as a form of Pelagenic ultranationalism, meaning it's built around the myth of national rebirth. The nation was great, it was destroyed or humiliated, and now it must be reborn through radical action and unified will. Fascism occupies its own lane. That part of what is part of what makes it so dangerous and so hard to categorize, and why it keeps finding new hosts in political environments. But here's a philosopher you've probably never heard of, but like Julius Evola. He arguably the most influential fascist philosophers of the 20th century for modern extremist movements. Evola was an Italian philosopher who thought Mussolini wasn't radical enough. He pushed fascism into a territory of pure mysticism or a spiritual hierarchy. His most famous book, Revolt Against the Modern World, published in 1934, argues that the modern world itself, democracy, equality, science, secularism, is a fail. It falls from, not fail, but it falls from a higher ancient spiritual order. He believed in a rigid spiritual hierarchy where warrior aristocrats ruled over priests, merchants, and laborers. He drew from Hinduism's caste system, where from ancient Rome, from Norse mythology, mixing them into a vision of a world of the modern world had destroyed, and that it needed to be violently restored. But his work is still read today from neo-fascist and alt-right and radical traditionalist class circles globally. He is a proof that these ideas don't die. They evolve and find new audiences in every generation. But let's kind of talk about the three main, like fascism versus authoritarianism and totalitarianism. What's the difference between these three? Because people use these interchangeably, but they are not the same thing, which I just get so upset about. You calling everything fascist when it's actually authoritarian or totalitarian, like, oh my God. But it's okay, I'll explain it. Authoritarianism is the broad category. Any system where power is concentrated and political freedoms are restricted is authoritarian. That includes fascism, but also military juntas and absolute monarchies and one-party states. Totalitarianism is a specific kind of authoritarianism where the government doesn't just control politics, it tries to control all aspects of life. Art, culture, family, thought, speech, religion. Both fascist regimes and Stalinist communism were totalitarian. Fascism is a specific ideology where the pillars of that philosophy we talked about: ultranationalism, the leader principle, anti-rationalism, glorification of violence, and the totalitarian statism. Not every authoritarian regime is fascist because every fascist regime is totalitarianism or totalitarian. I hope you all understood that. If you don't, please comment. I can explain it further. But this distinction matters because it tells us what we're actually dealing with, and when we analyze a political system. But there was also another philosopher by Umberto Eco's. I think I'm saying this right. I don't know how to pronounce his names. But he has 14 features of eternal fascism. I want to get real for a second because I don't want to make this into a history lesson, but the philosophy DNA of fascism and the building blocks of the ideology, they didn't vanish in 1945 when the Allied forces won World War II. They went underground. They mutated and they found new packaging, new language and new movements across the world. I sound like a fucking mad scientist because this is how fascism worked. The political theorist I just mentioned, Umberto Eco, himself a child in Mussolini's Italy, wrote a famous essay called Fascism in 1995, where he identified 14 features of what we call internal fascism. Let me give you some of the key ones. The cult of tradition. The idea that truth was revealed in the ancient past and the modern world is the degradation of it. And the reject of modernism, distrust of intellectuals, scientists, experts. Feelings are more reliable than facts. Actions for action's sake. Thinking is for cowards. Real people act. Deliberation and nuance are signs of weakness. Fear of difference. The first appeal of a fascist movement is against the outsiders, the foreigners, the ones who don't belong. An appeal to a frustrated middle class. Fascism finds its base among people who feel economically threatened and culturally humiliated, people who need someone to blame. Obsession with the plot. There is always an enemy, internal or external, conspiring against the nation. The specific enemy changes, the structure is always the same. Life is permanent warfare. Pacifism is treason. Struggle is life. The enemy. It sounds so dumb, but this is what they actually believe. I'm laughing because I can't believe I read this stuff and I researched it and I wrote it down and I can't believe I actually, do they actually believe this, that thinking is for cowards? But I shouldn't laugh. We're treating this like scholars. And he also says that contempt is for the weak. The poor deserve their poverty. The vulnerable deserve their suffering. Compassion is a weakness. Selective populism. The leader speaks for the people, but only the real people, the true people. Anyone who disagrees is not really a member of that party. Now, I'm going to point out modern movements and say, this is fascism. I'm not going to point that out and say this is fascism. That's for you to think and analyze. But I will say that these features don't require a man in a uniform watching or marching through the streets to be present. They can show up in suits and tweets and cable news segments and campaign rallies. So you have to study philosophies and know the patterns and also think for yourself. But why does this matter today? Some people are watching this and might wonder: are there people today who genuinely defend fascism as a philosophy, who think it was right? The honest answer is yes. I mean, when I was researching all of this, I believed that no one really believes this shit no more. But I mean, they do. But they with neo-fascist movements exist on every continent. They rebrand constantly, though. Sometimes as nationalism, sometimes it's traditionalism, sometimes as identity. Blah, blah, blah. They learn not to use the word fascism because the word carries too much baggage. But the ideas, the ultranationalism, the strong leader, the contempt for democracy, the glorification of struggle, the obsessions with enemy within, those ideas are very much alive. But here's what I want you to take away. You fight bad philosophy with better philosophy. You fight dangerous ideas with sharper thinking. You fight movements that want to turn people against their own reason by sharpening your own reasoning. The answer to fascism is not censorship alone. It's education, critical thinking, and a willingness to look hard things in the face without flinching. That's what we do on Triston Talks. And that's what I hope you take out of this video. But today we studied and we looked at all the stuff relating to fascism, ultranationalism, totalitarianism, anti-rationalism, leader principle, the glorification of violence. We talked about the philosophers. This is something I hope that added to your understanding, because the best defense against dangerous ideas have always been an informed thinking public. But that's it. I'm Tristan. Stay curious, stay critical, and never stop asking questions. Peace.